You are here with Lori Antonin
and Kimberly Phillip,
and we will be your moderators for this evening. We'll do a very quick introduction. So my name is Lori Antonin, and I am the National Representative at the Canadian Labour Congress in the Anti-Racism and Human Rights Department. For those of you who are not familiar with the Canadian Labour Congress, we are a central labor organization with 53 affiliates, so we speak on behalf of unions throughout the country, and our department specifically works on human rights and advocating for human rights. So I just wanted to say that this webinar is really important to me because these are conversations that we are not having enough of in the labor movement. And I'm hoping that we can walk away with a greater understanding of anti-Black racism and how our members are dealing with racism across the country in their workplaces.
Great. And I'm Kimberly Phillip. I'm a Senior Equality Officer at CUPE National. And so within the equality branch at CUPE, we do approach our work using a very intersectional lens where we look at the lives of folks who have been historically marginalized and oppressed, but looking at the multiple identities and experiences that they face. And so even though in my title I focus mostly on anti-racism, that doesn't stop me from looking at gender, from looking at sexual orientation, from looking at immigration status, religion, and so on. And so we are really excited to be collaborating with the Canadian Labour Congress on this really important webinar series. And we look forward to doing more of these and expanding the work and deepening the work in the very near future.
So let's go over some of the objectives for tonight. So tonight we will address anti-Black racism and what that means in the workplace, explore ways to name and challenge systemic racism, and create strategies to confront racism in the workplace.
So we are really interested to know who's here with us. And the title of this webinar series is Working While Black. But we recognize that there will be folks participating who may not identify as Black, but who are here to deepen their understanding and their knowledge of anti-Black racism and to find ways of addressing it effectively in their workplace, at home, and in their communities. But we would really love to know who in the webinar tonight identifies as African descent, or as Black. So if you can use the hands up option to let us know. Oh, we're going to use the poll. Yes, sorry. So here is where we use another element that's really exciting about this platform. It's the polling option. So as you will see, a question has come up where you choose yes or no. Oh, so you'll choose not Black or Black of African descent. So if you can just select, and yeah, sorry for the typo. If you can just select which of the two options best represents how you identify, that would be great. Thank you. Okay, awesome. So it seems, let's close the poll. Great. So I hope you can see the final results, but it shows that we have 54% of the participants tonight identify as non-Black and 46% identify as Black or of African descent. So this is great, and we're hoping that we all can share our experiences and our knowledge together because it seems to be a pretty equal number. Great.
Okay, so we have the pleasure to introduce our expert panels for this evening. So,
great. So we would love to welcome Natasha Tony. Natasha Tony is an incredible organizer and community member who works out in Vancouver, BC as an assistant steward for the International Alliance of Theatrical Stage Employees, Local 891. Natasha specializes in conflict resolution and labor relations and has done multiple workshops such as building inclusive organizations, facilitating conversations on equity and inclusion, anti-oppression training, and so on. And so we have invited Natasha to join us tonight because she brings a wealth of information as well as her own lived experience as someone who identifies as Black or of African descent within Canada.
Natasha, are you there?
I am there. Hi.
Hi.
Hi, Natasha.
Okay, and our next expert tonight is Falami Jones. Falami is an Indigenous African Nova Scotian woman who is a firehouse and has been creating change within African communities and global communities through her lifelong passion of wellness work. Falami has done academic research and work around women's issues and the intersections of their social determinants of health, and also is a midwife, which is really exciting. As an activist and community leader for over a decade, she has been privileged to organize, lobby, work, and socialize with great thinkers across the Caribbean and in her work as a midwife in Jamaica. She currently owns Kwacha House Cafe in Nova Scotia, which focuses on a social enterprise model and operates similar to a co-op. The cafe has a very specific mandate of politicizing concerns of marginalized communities in an effort to raise the voices of her disadvantaged groups. Her family background is very much rooted in union work and the civil rights movement. Her father, Dr. Burnley Rocky Jones, was one of her great contributors, having been an internationally recognized activist. So we are so excited to welcome these two powerhouses of women, Black and African identified women, to lead this webinar tonight. So
Woo!
Thank you, Falami. Say hi.
Hi. Greetings, everybody from the blizzard of Nova Scotia.
Okay. So Falami and Natasha, I'm going to ask you both a question, and I would love for you to address them both. And that's just kind of like to break the ice a bit and to get the participants knowing another side of you besides the very important professional organizing side. Mm-hmm. So the first question, what excites you about doing anti-racist work?
This is Natasha speaking. I think that, the short answer for me growing up as a Black woman in Canada, in the West Coast, but also in Saskatchewan as a teenager, was that I really wanted to and needed to have these conversations and to address what I was witnessing and experiencing and feeling, but I was often met with opposition or told that it wasn't something that we talk about. And for myself, doing the work that we do now, it was really finding it was more of a puzzle piece, a challenge for me to find a way to talk about equity and inclusion that was going to make that shift. And so for me, when I'm in a room full of members or participants in the classroom and where we get to do this kind of work, I feel finally, we've arrived at a time where we can start to have these necessary conversations to make the collective shift.
Amazing. Thank you. Falami?
Yeah, so sorry, my phone is ringing at the same time. Yeah, I think for me it kind of mirrors what Natasha is saying. Nova Scotia has lots of history in terms of African Nova Scotians and First Nations communities and colonialization, much along, the rest of Canada in other ways. And I think for me is finding ways to engage difficult conversations around race, which is always the hardest. And I've had to do that from being very young and sometimes being the only Black student in all the way from actually my elementary right up until I got to university in Toronto. Did I ever see a Black professor or teacher in my life? I never experienced going to a doctor and having the opportunity to have a black doctor, because I didn't see that in Nova Scotia. But I'm here again, and with the history of seeing my father and my aunt do great union work, that collective kind of grassroots perspective I think sometimes is missing. And just being able to be part of an organization like Working While Black, which pushes back against some of those social norms that sort of reinforces white privilege, I get to engage in difficult conversations in meaningful ways, and I think in ways that supports dialogue that needs to happen. So yeah.
Thank you. And now the final question. It is 2031. What kind of future do you envision, do you desire, do you see for our communities within the context of doing anti-racism work?
Wow.
First of all, I need to figure out how old I'm going to be.
Yeah, that's kind of scary. I think for me, I think a community where difference is not seen as something that needs to be homogeneous, but actually is appreciated in its difference, that I can be a black woman and be seen as a black woman. We fought so hard to be acknowledged in terms of our racial identities, to now, meeting people and, socializing with people that say, I don't see color, love sees no color, and yet I walk in this world, in this experience, my whole socialization is as a black woman. So I think for me, it would be a beautiful place to be in that difference and be appreciated in that difference.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and this is Natasha speaking, and I agree. I think that we'll see on another slide talking about racial equity and really kind of thinking about dismantling structural racism. It's that idea of, where I experience racial equity is actually in my home and within my family. And as soon as I walk outside the door, that's where I know that I'm putting on the armor to know that whether it's microaggressions that are going to hit me, or seeing not only myself being treated differently, but others being treated differently. Again, if I was to be short and sweet about this, it would be the opposite of what we are seeing and experiencing today, especially highlighted on the news programs and social media of today. And so if that social equity or racial equity, referring to what's generally a non-racist society, and when we're talking about that those differences are celebrated and a part of who we all are, would be where I would love to be. But, sometimes I think that feels like, okay, utopia. Yep. What I do want is the safety for all of us. What I do want is to be able to know that not only my family, but that everyone's family is able to be safe, and that it doesn't become a life or death situation. And when we're talking about anti-black racism, the reality of that is that it is life and death.
In so many ways, that even spiritually.
Sorry,
go ahead.
Sorry, follow me, Natasha. Thank you so much. I just want to say very quickly to the people who just joined the webinar, welcome. We've just introduced our panelist for this evening, Natasha Tony and Falami Jones. And so what we're going to do is we're going to start with our walking through the objectives for this evening. Great. So, wonderful panelist, it's all yours.
Okay. So thank you. I think that, first when we're talking about and referring to anti-black racism, we're talking about this systemic and historically grounded discrimination towards people of African descent. And also when we're referring to that, we're referring often to black people. And it involves stereotypes, attitudes, and actions that are based on the assumption that something is inherently wrong with black people. And so when we're talking about anti-black racism, it's important for us to understand that it's most often subtly buried and embedded in our Canadian social structures and our collective subconscious. Blacks often face the most discrimination in Canada from one end of the country to another. And then, of course, our Indigenous Aboriginal folks and South Asians. And it's important that when talking about equity and inclusion, that people of color aren't always lumped in, and the assumption that that we assume that oppression is oppression. And so by actually naming and calling it what it is when we are discussing oppression for black people, this allows for us to identify our struggles and the impacts of the reality of actually being black. And when we do this, when we do the work that we're doing today and the continued conversations, it's really important for us to link the past, the present, and then when we start to do the future focus work, to be able to make those links, because our history, our collective history, is extremely important. And we must know that where we've come from and how we got there, especially for us to move forward to the next steps that we need to do. And so, Philomi, do you have some examples that you could give of?
Yeah, thanks for that, Natasha. You hit it right on, and I think when you're talking about anti-black racism, we're talking, and we'll get into a bit more about how that shows up, how it manifests. But I wanted to give a scenario, sort of a case scenario. It's a union scenario on a bargaining agenda. So for everybody that's listening, and we're gonna just read off this quick little scenario, case scenario, and then we're gonna kind of engage on what anti-black racism is and how that comes out in work. So there's a racialized member who is non-black and who gets elected as a member of a leadership position in the union. Another black member asks her, "What are the equity priorities of our bargaining agenda?" The member was told the bargaining agenda is supposed to meet everyone's needs, and that since she was a racialized member holding a leadership position, there's no issue of equity. So from that scenario, it actually kind of came out from the amazing Rise Up conference, where we were trying to kind of pull out just an example of how anti-black racism presents itself. And sometimes, as Natasha was saying, it can be lumped into an overall arching experience of racism. But in the reality, we know that anti-black racism looks different. And so that example is supposed to highlight that when we actually pull it apart and start looking at, for example, in the workplace, who holds the managerial positions, who holds the leadership positions, are they predominantly white? And if they are racialized people or people of color, are they black people? And so when you start to pull that apart, you actually see, actually, no, there's not that many black people in managerial positions. And yet, when we think of racism in that case scenario, which is actually true, one of the people at the conference had come forward and said, to an Asian man and said, I get that we're talking about anti-racism, but it feels a lot different for me. And so the example was that he had gone to his manager and said, we really need to look at equity, and his manager, who was Asian, says, well, we don't have to think about equity because, I'm a racialized person and I hold a managerial position. But when you actually looked at his organization, or we look at any other organization for that matter, in most cases, black people still take lower positions. And so I think that's kind of the conversation that I'm interested in having, which is around how that looks and what does that mean for black people in terms of the discrimination that we feel that looks a bit different. Tasha, you there?
I'm there, yeah, and I think that is, that is definitely, excellent examples of what happens. And, I am a rep and deal with a lot of issues in the workplace too. And, there's examples for us as well as reps is that, I will see that there's often stronger discipline imposed, less promotional opportunities or access, I'm hearing from members, experience that people are bringing forth. And when you talk about somebody talking about their experience to somebody else in a position of authority, that often our experiences are minimized and seen as an overreaction. We're labeled as angry or opinionated when expressing or opposing our views. And our confidence often is seen and described as intimidating or a threat. And the impact often leaves workers feeling confused, feeling less than, and questioning their own sanity in the workplace based on these certain things. And so being told that anti-Black racism doesn't even exist in the workplace is an absolute untruth. And often that reality for many of us, that when we're speaking about our experience at work, or as activists in the labor movement, that often our experiences around anti-Black racism are minimized.
Yeah, and it leaves a sense of powerlessness, doesn't it? You know, or you'll have other examples of where if you you do come forward, it takes so much energy, it takes so much of your person to bring things forward, especially if you're the quote-unquote token, or there's one or few of you, and then you might get, which is interesting when we talk a little bit more about ally work. Sometimes what I've seen is where someone else will take that fight up for you, and so all of a sudden you're now your voice is powerless because you didn't even have the opportunity to voice this in a place that's safe. And so you're no longer even the expert in your experience of racism. And I think that's how anti-Black racism manifests. And as we've seen, and we spoke about also at the conference around the policing, and now with Black Lives Matters, and it's just it's reached on so many different levels. I know for Halifax, in terms of education, I'm just looking at the slide here, because we're not just talking about the workplace, we're actually talking about it in terms of a community level. In Nova Scotia, we have devastating rates of IPP, which is like individual programs that is set up for students with learning disabilities, where Black students hold those spots, which affects their ability to actually go on to university. And I mean, it's how many times fold higher than any other white student, for example, and I'm not sure about your rates, but I'm sure it's across Canada, in Nova Scotia, where children are put on these special programs, and if you're on an IPP program, you can't go on to university. The child welfare system, I mean, we know that there's disproportionate rates of Black children, First Nations children, who hold up many spaces and homes in the child welfare system. So I think it's a lot larger than just us talking about the workspace, and I think when we can start to broaden our idea of how anti-Black racism affects us in terms of our whole person, our whole community, then we can start to kind of talk about where change can happen.
I agree. And so when you talk about this holistic approach, and Kimberly talked about intersectionality, and when we talk about the workplace, and with this slide that's up right now and talking about what it looks like in Canada, as human beings, we can't separate that this is our reality. So that if I have family that is being carded or harassed by the police, if there isn't enough food, if there isn't the safe housing for us to live, that I'm bringing that also into the workplace with me, right? And so that when we are having these conversations, and often there's this intensity and this passion when somebody is talking about their experience, it's understanding that what we're carrying with us based on the anti-Black racism looks a lot like this.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, and then we carry with us, I know for me and I'm sure for everyone else, especially from a historical community, it was funny, I was talking with my daughter's teacher the other day. I carry my daughter, when she goes on to tell her stories and experiences of racism, she carries my stories. She carries my father's stories. She carries her grandfather and her grandmother's stories. And we don't just come with that one experience. That's a lot to take on and to carry. And I see how that also impacts the way that, she socializes or even thinks of herself. So yeah, it's a lot larger. It's very deep. It's very deep, and it's rooted.
Can we go to the next slide, please?
Yeah, I'm just looking for that. Yes. Okay.
And so I think, you know, in having this conversation, Falami, and it's that we're starting to understand, and we're talking about it from our perspective, from the inside out. But if we were to bring it outside and start to talk about the systems of oppression, or understanding how to dismantle some of the systems of oppression when we're talking about anti-Black racism, this slide talks about structural racism, which I'm going to read this one out specifically. We're not going to read out all of them, but to understand that when we're asking questions from the panelists, when the panelists are asking questions, when we're answering, that using some of this terminology, whether we're talking about it using this or not, is that this is how we're really kind of breaking down talking about anti-Black racism. And so understanding structural racism and that oppression, it's a system in which public policies, institutional practices, cultural representations, and other norms work in various, often reinforcing ways to perpetuate racial group inequity. And it identifies dimensions of our history and culture that have allowed privileges associated with whiteness and disadvantages associated with color to endure and adapt over time. So structural racism is not something that a few people or institutions choose to practice. Instead, it has been a feature of the social, economic, and political systems in which we all exist. And I really like this, you know, talking about structural racism, because when we're talking about white supremacy, when we're talking about white privilege or systemic racism, it's really important for us, in order for all of us to have this conversation, we first have to understand that we're all under that same umbrella. And so the learning and unlearning that has to happen with structural racism has actually been the key to having these conversations around equity and inclusion.
Very much so. And when you know, what's kind of nice about how the slide shows it right down to individual racism, you know, many times you'll be in conversations, I'm sure at work, you know, I'm talking with the participants too, where you'll hear, well, I'm not a racist, or we'll be looking at our organization and we'll have policies in place, but we actually don't see change. We don't actually see any more racialized people, or for that matter, Black people, in particular positions. And it's not by chance that certain positions in organizations, for example, I'll just keep speaking from my experience in Nova Scotia, I have a health background, and in most of the health institutions that are government run, it tends to be that the diversity coordinator usually is held by someone that's racialized or Black. But then once we move outside of that and we start looking at, there again, the managerial positions or people that make policy or influence policy, we don't see ourselves there. But yet when we start to have those conversations, you know, you pull out a book and it says, but well, we have an anti-racism policy, you know, I mean, we've done good. But then when you actually look at it, it's not reflective and it's not retaining people. So I think there's lots more conversation around how we can look at institutional racism and structures of racism and how that actually happens.
Falami and Natasha, hi. Maybe at this point we can see if participants have any questions.
Oh yeah, sorry.
No,
we can get on a rant here.
And so again, participants, some of you have already used the questions box. So we encourage you, if you have any questions, please type them in the box and we'll get the panelists to respond. And for those of you who have just arrived, you should see the question option on your right in that longer bar of sorts, panel.
I'm wondering if at this point in this conversation, we'll wait to see after the questions, that we'll give another case study too.
Yeah, sure, go ahead. Because we haven't got any questions as yet, so go ahead.
So everybody has we'll give you about a minute or so to place your questions in, but in the meantime, go ahead with the case study.
Okay. So here's another one that that we've selected. So this is another union example. One of the resolutions at the union's national convention proposed the establishment of a designated seat for equity as one of the executive officers' positions. A delegate opposed the resolution, arguing all officers are responsible for equity. We should not confine the equity agenda to one position, department, or program. So I think, Natasha, I think we were talking about that before. Maybe you can give a little bit of perspective because you're with the union around that. How do you see this fitting in terms of the points that we were talking about in terms of systemic racism, white privilege, institutional racism, and your experience in the union?
So can you just read the last little bit of that again?
Sure, yeah. No, it was just basically that, you know, there was a resolution passed that there should be a designated seat for equity.
Yeah.
And then it came back from the delegate saying, well, all officers are responsible for equity, so we shouldn't confine, you know, one particular position or department to have an equity agenda.
Yeah, okay. I have experience with this in the sense that where this is the foundation building piece of it. And so often what is happening for activists who are doing this work is that we get the policy, we draft up something that is going to go onto the convention floor. I've heard stories where it's taken 17 times for something to pass, or even 7 times for something to pass. But then once it is there, passed, and the recommendation then goes into policy, whether it's in their constitution or bylaws, what happens though is that often that idea of, oh no, we all can do it, or a member is a member is a member, is what we'll get. Mm-hmm. And the understanding now for myself in this is that I see that the foundation of understanding the importance of equity seats has not happened within a said organization. And so what's happening is that people are putting themselves out there to make this shift. But if the organization hasn't had the education, hasn't truly had the understanding of the importance of having all voices at the table and to explore what representation looks like and to even think outside the box, what often is happening is those get shut down, or they just stay policy and get dusty because people aren't wanting to run for equity seats because it's not safe for me to be the only person. This is where we talk about tokenism after a while, right? So that I think that when this is happening, we need to start to understand as activists in this movement is the foundation work probably needs to be done before we can move forward.
And then I think even in doing that work is the expectation of that person, right? Like how many times have we been in those positions of tokenism where you get exhausted because then you become the expert, right? As if we have all of the solutions and understanding, as if we can take on all the equity issues, one person, right? And I think that in my experience as well, maybe not in unionized, but just in terms of just, you know, grassroots places, that people get tired. Black folks get tired. And it's a lot to take on when you're the only person, especially if you couple that and layer that with white privilege, and you have the white person that comes in and is like, well, you know, I don't know what to do because I have this issue, and, you know, it's so-and-so is black, and they think somehow I was racist, or, you know, and then now you have to start doing all the teaching and the learning and the unpacking, but not just for yourself, but for a whole organization. And I think that with today's day where everybody, you know, is trying to be so politically correct, whatever that means, and then there's this push for like cultural competency, but yet that the self-work, the underlying foundational work, as you were saying, isn't being done, the onus becomes on the token person to carry that. And that's where it gets really dangerous, exhausting. And you know, and I even think sometimes we even internalize our racism in ways that are really unhealthy.
Falami, there's a question from one of the participants to you, and I just wanted to say that we just want to thank the participants for sending in questions. A lot of them have been affirming all of what you've shared so far, Natasha and Falami. And so the question for you, Falami, is with regards to individual racism or the I don't see color argument, when we are approaching discussions with white comrades, how do we deal with the inevitable white fragility? And so when you're finished answering that question, we're going to move to a polling question to get the audience participating again. Do you want me to read the question again?
Yes, if you can restructure that question. Yeah. And I'm wondering, even to kind of break it down a little bit so it can be clear to everyone else.
Sure.
I'm also just really conscious who's online and who might not have that same language.
Yeah, absolutely. So maybe when you're responding, if you don't mind, maybe spending a minute just explaining what white fragility is. But so the question is, when working specifically with white comrades and co-workers, particularly those who use the argument of I don't see color, how do we deal with their response that embodies like so much guilt and pain, etc. In other words, white fragility?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And, you know, I don't know if I have the exact answers, but I can tell you in my experience. And, you know, we're going to talk a little bit about that in terms of strategies. But with, for example, Working While Black, it is 3 organizations. One is Solidarity Halifax, the other is UJAMA. And Solidarity Halifax is a predominantly white organization that looks at anti-capitalism and anti-racism, and they intentionally make sure that they make it in their mandate and their priority to look at themselves and to think about white privilege. But does that mean in spaces that that doesn't come up? Yes, it does. Does that mean when you're working, you know, we've had some in terms of the stories that have come up on the site, or just being a black person who always hears stories, all of us have, you know, how do you address that? I think for me, the beauty is in the honesty and the willingness to engage in safe conversations. And so if somebody comes to me and says to me, you know, I've had this experience, but I'm you know, I'm not a racist. Like, I'm sorry. I don't even see you as a black person. Like I had started from the beginning, I would say, well, then you must think I'm invisible, because I'm pretty sure I see you as a white person, and I know you see me as a black person. So love me in who I am, and love me in the place that you can meet me in. Understand me from that place, and if that means you need to do more work. So there's times when I've had to say, you know, you need to go back and do some more research. Like, I'm not going to do all that work for you. I can lead you, I can direct you, but it's there again, the onus needs to come from those that are in the privileged and power positions. And so just self-checking, like when you're in conversations, for example, in our Working While Black circle, there's times when it's got really difficult, and I'm talking about very politicized people who have done lots of self-work. And do not think that that white privilege doesn't come. It does. It's there. It's everywhere. Actually, I have a white mother. It comes up. You know, it is. It just is. So being able to find power and voice as a racialized person, as a black person, and being, if you are a white person, being conscious of that privilege constantly self-check. And not in terms of a point of guilty, like, am I doing that white guilt thing again? No, I'm not talking about that. Like, internally having those questions with yourself. And I think it comes out, like, you'll find a way to do that process that's safe. And I mean, we're still human at the end of the day. We're still human. We all make mistakes, and we're learning. You know, we're learning in ourselves and in our person. So I don't know if that quite answers it, but I can say that I've had those difficult conversations with family and with very politicized people, and we make room for learning, and it gets it gets emotional. Sometimes it can get ugly, but we give permission to go there and just keep pushing yourself.
Absolutely. And so one of the participants has made a note that an hour is definitely not enough, and we recognize that.
Yes.
So I just wanted to do a quick check-in that it is 7:47 and we scheduled to wrap up at 8 p.m. And we really want to try to respect people's time, but we do have a few more questions from the audience and we do have a few more slides. So Natasha, if you don't mind addressing this question, and then we can move ahead. This question is from someone who identifies as an ally, and they ask, can you please share more of those concrete scenarios of racism in unions and how allies have or have not been helpful? As the participant has found the concrete examples and stories particularly helpful, and they noted that you mentioned allies sometimes taking over either subtly or not so subtly. So if you can speak more to some of the ways in which allies can be helpful and how they have not been helpful, Natasha.
Yeah, I think that in the understanding timing as well is that we've purposefully put in the handouts something around allyship and then also around equalizing power among us. And I think that some of the most, the best superhero powers that an ally can have is to actively listen. Okay, and I feel like this is also one of those spots where, and it goes back to talking about what an ally can do, is that sometimes it is up to the ally to have those difficult conversations, and that if we are in a room that is highly politicized, so whether that's in the labor movement, in the work site, and something has been said by a black person about their experience, and you see that it's been minimized, it is an ally's job often to talk about the microaggressions that just happened there. It isn't always my role as a black woman to then educate somebody and put myself in further vulnerable situation. And so that when we are in the labor movement, and this is happening, when we are out there on the convention floors or drafting a policy, and you're hearing that people are making conversation about something that really they don't know anything about, it is probably up to you as that ally to find those educational tools to work with folks in coming on board around this equity and inclusion piece of it. And so I get that examples are definitely something that are important, but I think that in our workplace and being able to have this conversation, but then also to look at those handouts and then go back into the work and activism that you do, that you're able to then start to model some of that behavior yourself. And I think that the other thing that allies need to understand is that you do hold a lot of power. In educating yourself on issues, and being on here today is the first step and not the only step, and to continue to learn so that when you're having those conversations and doing the support or listening and creating space to hold space for those of us that need to have the conversations, that you're doing it from a place of knowledge.
Yeah, you hit it bang on, and I think it's, I don't know if we have more questions, but I think that's a perfect segue in terms of going to strategies.
Yes.
I'm not sure if there's another polling question. We did, yeah.
Yeah, okay. There's one more. I just wanted to thank everybody who's on the line right now. We are reaching an hour in about 10 minutes, but we will be going over 1 hour. We just want to thank the people who cannot stay. This is great feedback. It means that we need to do more of these webinars. And what I'll do right now is, before going into strategies, we're just going to ask one more polling question. All right. So for those who, again, have entered the conversation a little bit late, on the dashboard, if you go down to the polling, we will have a question that will pop up. This is a two-part question. So in your workplace, are the majority of decision-making positions, so manager, director, leadership, etc., occupied by white people? We'll give you about a couple of seconds to fill that up. Okay, so the results are in. 94% of you have said yes. 6% of you have said no.
Wow.
Right. So I think this is a perfect segue to move into strategy. Yeah. Talk about how we shift those power dynamics.
Yeah. Is this the second? Is there one more part to this?
Yes, there is. There's a two-part. Okay. Yeah, it's a two-part poll. Just a moment. So a follow-up to that. Oops. Give us just a moment here. Give us just a moment.
Well, while we're waiting for that, I think, Natasha, we can we were interested to see how the poll was going to come back, and we all kind of know the answer anyway. But isn't it astonishing when you see that, like right here with the 41 attendees, that yep, it's still alive. Like racism is still alive.
Yeah, I think that it is. I mean, I love stats. That's my thing. Is that, you know, it is something that allows us to know where the work needs to be done and to address it, right?
Mm-hmm.
The second part,
especially for talking about. Oh, sorry. Yep. Go ahead. Did you want to?
Yeah, just the second poll came up. A lot of people have been voting already. So the question is, are racialized workers confined to particular positions and or departments, i.e. diversity coordinator, a division or a department? And so we've got about 10 seconds or so.
And I think we also mean like positions as in janitorial positions and positions that we commonly find racialized people in as well. So not just diversity coordinators, because not everybody has diversity coordinator, but in terms of, do we find that people are particularly stuck in certain positions or departments?
Okay. So it's interesting. 50% said yes and 50% said no.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's a perfect segue into strategies.
Yeah, so I was thinking in terms of strategies, I always love to think of grassroots things as well, and I think we can look in a minute at some strategies, historical strategies that more come out of recommendations. But creating space and time to explore anti-Black racism with those who are most impacted. I think, Natasha, you were talking about that, like making space. The webinar is a wonderful place where people can kind of have collective conversations across the globe, really, and engage. That's one way. But also in your own workspace, at your kitchen table. I've seen it happen. I've done it. You know, it's beautiful. Here's a strategy. I have done it with Working While Black and in other organizations where we made a point to organize, go into Starbucks, for example, and begin to discuss racism, anti-Black racism even, openly in that forum. Just an average day, just a few of us organized and said, you know what, we need to start talking about this in ways where even if you're not invited into that space, you can overhear it. And so you need to be creative in thinking of ways of how to organize and how to challenge racism. It's not always going to be in the form of a lecture or a webinar. But I'll tell you, through those kinds of conversations, and especially at the cafe, for example, what was unique about it is you'd have, politicians have to want to look good and who happen to pop in and decide to have a coffee, while you might have, some other kind of community organization that's sitting there dialoguing in the same space. And next thing you know, people are, because if you're in tight spaces, you're over-listening in conversations. And now we're engaging with people that we might not normally engage with and talking about difficult conversations. So I think that's a really interesting way to think of strategies outside of the box. But definitely also in terms of inclusion of policies and programs, I don't know. I think I would like to just acknowledge some work that has already been done. The Challenging Racism Going Beyond Recommendations, the report from the CLC, National Anti-Racism Task Force. This was done in 1997, so 20 years ago. And I'm just going to quickly read a few bullets of the recommendations around action and strategy. So, one of the points that they made, unions adopt internal anti-racism action plans which include guidelines on recruitment, hiring practices, and goals for contract positions, permanent and full-time positions, and education and research. They have organizing plans and collective bargaining strategies that specifically address anti-racism. The affiliates and federations of labor provide funding for the establishment of anti-racism and human rights departments that have their own budgets and are fully staffed by workers of color or racialized people. That unions ensure participation of racialized members, specifically those underrepresented as Black people, at all steps of the collective bargaining process. That unions conduct surveys of their membership to determine the representation of racialized people, and at every convention there'll be a report on this. That unions develop an anti-racism education plan of action into existing courses, materials, and self-education packages for their leadership, and regular delivery to unionized and unorganized workplaces. So that's an example. I could go on because it's a whole lot. We've been talking about it in terms of the people that have been organizing in the panelists. But these recommendations came out of an anti-racism task force in 1997. And here we are, 2017, still trying to engage as if that work has never been done. That's what's alarming to me. Sorry, Tasha. Yeah, what's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that, when we had this conversation around, and it is on one of the slides, around systems of oppression, is progress and retrenchment. And I think that often when we get to this point of strategizing in facilitating these conversations, there are many people that are feeling frustrated. One, because they know the history, and here we are again doing this, or for folks that really feel like, what is happening here, and why are we still here? And I think that in order for us as activists to understand kind of the ebb and flow of this work, is that there is progress and then there is that retrenchment, and that is actually part of the system of oppression. And this term refers to the pattern in which progress is made through the passage of legislation, our court rulings, policies, any other kind of formal mechanism that aim to promote racial equality. But the retrenchment refers to the ways that in which this progress is very often challenged, neutralized, and undermined. And in understanding that we have these strategies in place, and they're not necessarily new, but it's understanding that that is a piece of the oppression, that when we have these strategies, that we're always continuously having markers to be able to keep it alive, and so to actually maintain that momentum of what it is that we want to do, and to keep it in there. And in order to do that, we can have all of the policies and education in place, but if we stop talking about it, if it's not woven into who we all are as activists, as people, workers, labor movement people, is that the conversation we see stops, right?
Yeah.
Or we've only come this far, and then the oppressive piece of that retrenchment comes back. And so there really truly needs to be, in any of this work that we're doing, is to put the structures in place to how do we look at these policies? How do we have that funding always in place that we can do another equity audit if need be, so that it's not considered a one-off, but this is the continuous work that we do and the strategies that we make and going forward.
Yeah, yeah. That's so important. And I think what I'm really interested in is there again confronting racism through creative ways that are current. And policies are awesome, and we need those in place. But like you said, how do we keep it alive? How does it maintain its realness in the moment and today? And I think, like, there's an example. How did we go from 97, or there's other stuff here in 1995, and we're in a webinar kind of talking about it as if it's new, which we know it's not for those of us that have been around or have had family members that have been doing this fight for a long time. But I think it comes back to who are the people that are making the policies and who gets to actually enforce them, if you would. You know, how are we measuring the retention rates? And who is doing that? Who's doing the hiring? And so unless those, the mechanisms of that is changed, we'll always continue to have a conversation on a grassroots level, which is beautiful in some ways, but in terms of like that upstream thinking of making change on upper levels, we have to start seeing the hiring change on those managerial positions and so forth.
That's right, and that may become some of that union work in working with the employers, right? The union and labor movement are the ones that have the equity lens and are putting that into their collective agreements and putting that and pushing that through with the employers. And that's where we in the labor movement have that collective power that we need to use once we've trained ourselves up on equity and inclusion.
Yeah, exactly.
So we have a couple questions from participants that sort of have a common theme. So I'm going to try to combine them since we are at 8:04 p.m. So in cases where there is resistance to engage in change, to engage in education, or where those structures and processes are just not present because maybe you're in a small town or the organization just hasn't done that work, the workplace just don't have those policies. So in the absence of and in the case of resistance, how do you suggest that we engage in this sort of work in a way that is empowering and that allows us to use our agency as Black folks in the workplace?
Those are some really good questions. Tasha, do you want to start first, or do you have something that's coming to mind?
Yeah, I mean, I have been that person, whether it is in the small town or in workplace where these kind of conversations were actually seen as a threat, and you know, being told to that I better stop having those conversations. And so I think that, you know, when we're talking about this, and to be honest, I mean, there's a certain vulnerability when that's happening in your workplace and you're getting that kind of pushback. And so after kind of picking myself up and being able to strategize, and, you know, what I've done is I needed to do some organizing of the people that were in my world, whether that was in the work site or in the labor movement as a whole. And I started to be able to, I needed to tell my story and what my experience was. And, you know, it was relying on my friends, who many of them aren't Black, to be able to be the spokesperson and to start to understand where things had gone wrong for me. I also want to be very clear, though, that sometimes when we are in small towns or in the workplace and we are the only people there, that it isn't necessarily the safest for us to be activists and to be able to do that. But I do think that it is in building building in some of that strength. But first and foremost, it is actually using the safety of looking to see if it's even safe for me to do this. Because it is so easy for us to have you know, to be brought up on certain issues that were not our work performance, when really our work performance is fine, right? That I'm very cautious sometimes of that. If you are somebody who is in the labor movement, though, and it is being able to start to get involved in a way that even as a member, if you can be a delegate, if there are those equity seats where you can then go to conventions and find folks. I remember for myself, first CLC convention, and there was a caucus, and I had no idea that there was a caucus for colored workers, and it was amazing for me to go in there as somebody who works in isolation most times, right? So that it is actually finding and doing the community building when doing this activist work.
No, you hit it right on, exactly what I was going to say in terms of self-care. Like, I just come right back to self-care, you know, and part of that means, just like you said, Natasha, finding friends, finding family. I think that speaks for all of those that are in that moment, who you can trust and who you can just kind of let it out with, because it is, you are very vulnerable if you are one of the few Black people in an organization. And I don't know if you've ever seen too, sometimes it actually works against you if there's only two of you. You know, sometimes they almost pitch you, you know, so that one is trying to overachieve than the other, and it's just, you know, it really goes back to the historical experience of, like, you know, the host, quote unquote, Black person. I'll refrain from everything else, and the field slave, right? And sometimes I've seen that too, where, you know, when we should be working together and trying to organize to support each other, we end up being pitted against each other because one has to, you know, you need to shine. You need to be that person, that Black person that got it and who can do it. And that's really difficult. I also would say, like, I mean, unless you're in a real rural community, and even then, like, I've lived in some rural parts of Nova Scotia, that's the beauty in finding other racialized people or allies that have done enough unpacking that the white privilege isn't going to consume them full of guilt, where you can, you know, let go and really talk about how to support if you're going through things. But you need a collective. Like, I find it really rare that you can ever go through an experience while working as being Black and not have a supportive collective. And then organizing and finding ways to let it out, right? So that's what's great about working while Black in terms of sharing your stories. Like, I think this is what's so unique about the organization or, like, network of people that I'm with, is that we call to people to share their stories. And so what we found is that, like, there's this flood of stories of anti-Black racism that people have been holding. Like, it's so devastating. People, you know, Black folks are holding those stories with them because they're so vulnerable, because they can't talk to their manager, because they can't trust anybody. And even if they do tell their family and friends, it's okay, you know, you can get through it, but they still got to go back to work every day. And so what happened is people found, like, working while Black was like, we have this space, like, come share. And now we're challenged, which is a great challenge, and we're up to the challenge, is what to do with that. Because people, Black folks, have now, like, you know, almost dumped their spaces of pain and been like, I don't know what to do with this, but here's all these experiences that we have. And yet, whether they're unionized or ununionized, there's not very much infrastructure that's in place to support challenging those forms of racism, even though we have policies, even though we have the Human Rights Commission. And so there's a larger conversation that we still need to tease out, and maybe not tonight, but around how to support Black people, African people, through this experience, even as each other's allies, you know, because it's huge. It's huge. But all I can say is we are people of change, and it's possible. It's possible.
So it is now 8:11. We want to thank all of the participants who have stuck around. We had over 40 people participate, which is incredible. So we've put a question on the slide. We encourage participants to share strategies and actions that they have used in the question box, and we will harvest those ideas. But we were going to use this opportunity to move on and then try to wrap up this call in about 8 minutes. Is that okay with you, Falami and Natasha?
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I could sit here. We were saying we could talk all day. This is like a 12-hour session.
I know. An hour does not do us justice. So again, participants, if you can think about strategies and actions that you currently use, or that you have used or have seen used, please feel free to share them in the question box. And we'll move to the other slide where we just want to allow for Falami maybe to speak a bit about Working While Black, if you like. I know you did earlier. And then we'll, in the meantime, I'm going to go to the other slide. So participants, if you have questions and feedback, please feel free to email that information to the email address you see on the screen, lantonin@clc-ctc.ca. And yeah, so Falami and Natasha, you have a few minutes to wrap up. Thank you.
I do hope everybody puts in that feels like it, because there's 36 attendees still on, and that's a sign that we're holding on, right? Like people are willing to engage in the ways that we can through webinar. So please, give us that feedback that you need more time so we can push it upward to say we deserve more time. And we're going to take it. The next time we're going to take even more. I don't know about you, Natasha, in terms of creative ways of resisting anti-racism, especially in the workplace too, but I can tell you a story of one of the last workplaces I've been in too. I worked for an immigration resettlement agency, and a wonderful agency, did great work with refugee communities. We were up to 100 and I think it was 20 or 30, and they very much prided themselves in the fact that they were diverse. But there again, once we opened that up and looked at, well, how are you diverse? There was only less than 5 Black people that worked there. They came from anywhere else but Black. And yet, the racialized people, I feel it. I can feel it in the experience of just having to work in that kind of space. And I'm sure some of you who are racialized out there, all of a sudden you start looking around, you're looking to see who's Black or who has brown skin. And then next thing you know, you're in the kitchen and you're having conversations and you're talking. Isn't it interesting? You start talking about the experiences of racism, because that's what links us. And anti-Black racism is a bit different, but there still is an arching experience of racism. And I feel like, for example, so from that, I have a different, I guess maybe a privilege in terms of my voice and being from an activist community. I feel okay to challenge back a bit, but I understand that is a privilege from being from that community. So I went back and was like, where is your anti-racism policy? Because I'm not seeing very much representation in here, and I'm willing to support in looking at developing a policy, and specifically a hiring policy. And better yet, we're going to start meeting regularly, weekly, to have conversations about anti-racism, if that's going to be part of what's considered part of your mandate. And, I think once you get people on board, because I think ultimately people, sometimes they're resistant of change, but yet I wonder, and maybe that's my, the critical hope in me, that hopes that there is this calling and wanting for people that want change today. And so it was actually really well received. Doesn't mean the dialogue was easy, but to set up space and have those conversations, it happens, and we can make it happen. So you just gotta kind of find that internal voice and push back. And those allies that are out there, make sure that you source out and find ways, as Natasha was saying, to make space. So if you have the voice and the ability, then you take up space and you make space for those racialized people who are normally silenced or who don't normally have a voice in, whether it's in conference or conventions and so forth.
Thank you, Falami. And Natasha?
Yeah. Yes, I think that where we're at, and you know, I have the privilege to be working in the labor movement. I have the privilege of being a unionized worker. I have the privilege of being a Black woman, and I have also have the honor of having conversations around equity and inclusion in the labor movement and how we best to do this. And if I was to say where we are at in the labor movement right now, is that we need to consider that we are now doing the foundational work, one piece of the foundation at a time. But if we're doing it purposefully, I feel like we're going to make that shift that we need to make. And the difference that I've seen is instead of folks talking about equity and inclusion and saying this is what we need to do, and is that there are enough people that are willing, whether leadership or rank and file, to say, how do we do it? And this is where we're at right now. And so for myself, working with the CLC over the last few years, in meeting yourself, Falami, and I know that there are participants who are also a part of this movement, I want to encourage us to continue thinking about this as foundational building. This is the foundation with which we are going to make that collective shift.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I love
this was, sorry. Unmute. Hello. This is Lori Antonin. Incredible. This hour was truly uplifting, inspiring, and I'm looking at the comments that have come through. People don't even want this to stop. So
we have to have our own chat line, Working While Black chat line.
Yeah, even bringing it outside of Black History Month.
Yes.
So, and yes, these conversations will continue to happen. I just wanted to take a moment to thank both Falami and Natasha for being part of this. Yay! Thank you.
Yay to you guys for organizing.
And my sweet Kimberly for being here as well. And thank you to all the participants that have taken time out of your evening to be part of the Black History Month Working While Black webinar series. We had a lot of fun doing this, and I don't want people to forget that there are 2 more webinars this month. The next one is February 22nd at the same time, 7 p.m. on recognizing systemic 7 p.m. Eastern, that's true, recognizing systemic barriers at work, and the final one will be on February 27th, Collective and Community Organizing. We do also have a French webinar, Working While Black in French, that will take place on February 28th. So thank you again. I just want to let the speakers know that you are being thanked throughout the board here.
Yay!
And I'd like to wish everybody a good night, and thank you again for coming on. Kimberly has a final word.
Yeah, and just to remind you that please feel free to download the handouts, use them at your will. And participants, thank you so much for engaging so much. And we really look forward to having you on the other webinars. And we encourage you, if you want to see more of this kind of work in your workplace and your unions, you have convention space. You have an opportunity to make that happen. So please own that agency, organize, and do this collectively.
Yeah, and I'd also like to do the shout out to Working While Black Nova Scotia, because that site is also a great resource. A lot of our handouts, or some things from there, and some of our literature has come from that site. And so if there's any way that we can support, there was, I think, a new chapter that organized out of Ottawa. Like if people are interested in organizing a grassroots Working While Black, we can support in whatever way we can to do that.
Thanks, everyone. Have a
a
beautiful
good
night
Good
or
night.
afternoon.
Wherever you are in North America, there are people not from Canada on this line, so that's exciting too. Thanks for joining us.